rearranging your schedule today for this hearing. We're having some votes today a little earlier for Getaway Day, so I appreciate your working with us on this today. Again, good morning. Welcome to fiscal year 2015 budget hearing for the Environmental Protection Agency. Today we're joined by Administrator Gina McCarthy and Acting Chief Financial Officer Mary Ann Froelich to discuss the President's proposal for EPA's FY 2015 budget. Ms. McCarthy, I believe this is your first formal budget hearing before the subcommittee. Thank you for being here today. I know our members on both sides are interested in what your budget proposes and look forward to discussing some of your ongoing work. Overall, EPA's fiscal year 2015 budget proposes a level of $7.89 billion, which is $310 million or 3.8% below the enacted level. At this level, EPA's budget would be reduced for the fifth consecutive year following the historic increase in fiscal year 2010. I see this proposed reduction as good for the first step for this year's budget cycle, as it brings the agency's budget in line with more historic funding levels. It also brings the agency's budget in line with the levels under sequestration, but does so in a way that avoids employee furloughs and some of the other consequences associated with indiscriminate across-the-board cuts. I prefer to make targeted and strategic decisions about how we spend our money as we rein in the deficit. With that said, I appreciate the EPA appears to be identifying strategic efficiencies in its workforce, as the agency's payroll costs have been on an unsustainable path. This has been a priority for this subcommittee since 2011. I'm glad to see that we're aligned in this mission. I appreciate that EPA's FY15 budget proposes funding for a workforce of 15,000 employees, reflecting a 2,000 FTE reduction compared to 2011, and a level not seen since the late 1980s. Previous budgets often proposed payroll levels well above the agency's onboard personnel, leaving us to wonder how EPA would actually use those funds. As we move forward, I have concerns about the state of the nation's aging water infrastructure, particularly as it relates to the California drought. Last year, our subcommittee held a hearing to discuss alternate ways of financing our water infrastructure needs. So there's some options out there to help complement the Clean Water and Drinking Water State revolving funds. It's important from both the security and from an economic standpoint that we have a protective and efficient water infrastructure system. We often tend to discount the value of clean drinking water whenever we need it. That is until it's not there. I understand that the budget is full of tough choices, but one proposal that I'll let you know is unacceptable, at least to me, is the proposed elimination of the diesel emissions grants, otherwise known as DERA, which support the retrofit of older diesel engines. This is one of the few EPA programs that has been reauthorized in recent years, which is a testament to the bipartisan support for the program. As the DERA program is important as diesel engines power over 95% of commercial trucks. According to EPA's own estimates, every $1 spent on DERA upgrades has resulted in $13 worth of health and environmental benefits. So I don't understand why the administration would propose to eliminate this program with such a high return on investment, particularly when it aligns with the concept of realizing environmental benefits while creating jobs. The budget also eliminates funding for the Rural Water Technical Assistance Grants, for National Water Research Grants, and for state radon grants, which, while more than 21,000 people per year die from radon-related lung cancer. It seems to me that the administration is cutting successful bipartisan programs knowing that Congress will restore the funding. In doing so, this allows the administration to propose other new programs that we just don't have the funding to pay for in a constrained budget environment. These are the wrong priorities to cut. These are successful programs that achieve results without the heavy hand of top-down regulations. Meanwhile, the budget proposes increased funding for the administration's overzealous regulatory enforcement agenda. The administration's go-it-alone approach is not one that lends itself to building partnerships or developing sensible policies that lead to economic growth. Unfortunately, EPA continues to serve as a primary conduit to carry out that agenda. When the President issues a directive stating that EPA must propose a rule to regulate greenhouse gases from existing power plants by June 1st of 2014, then it's clear that the White House does not care what the rule says or about the impacts to American jobs. When the White House directs you to veto a mining permit before companies even had an opportunity to apply, then it's clear the administration is not serious about creating jobs. And the latest example was revealed on Tuesday, when EPA proposed the greatest expansion of federal control over land and water resources in the 42-year history of the Clean Water Act. Now, every small business and farmer could be subject to EPA fines if they disturb a puddle on their land. Meanwhile, EPA has previously stated that science would support Tuesday's rule. Yet, the Associated Scientific Study on connectivity of streams and wetlands to downstream waters has yet to clear the scientific peer review boards. So it's clear that the administration prefers to go it alone, without consideration for the cost of rules, impact on jobs, and without care for the scientific community has to say. Let me be clear. This subcommittee will continue to take whatever actions are necessary to inject some common sense into EPA's rulemaking process and provide certainty to farmers and small business so that they won't have to look over their shoulder fearing the EPA. So while some of the overall trends point to the right direction, the devil is in the details. Administrator McCarthy, I look forward to working with you on those details. I also look forward to keeping the lines of communication open. And with that, I know all members are interested in discussing various issues with you today, so I'll save my additional remarks for the period following your testimony, and pleased now to yield to my distinguished ranking member and friend, Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, my friend. We may have a couple of points of disagreement on this bill, but we will remain friends. Welcome, Administrator McCarthy. This being your first hearing in front of this subcommittee, where we want you to know that we greatly respect your dedication to public service and that of your staff, particularly taking on this role, which is about as difficult a role as any in the entire administration. But you have a long record of protecting the public's health and the environment, which is presumed to be a nonpartisan objective. And you also worked for then Governor Mitt Romney. So I would trust that this would be a nonpartisan, non-contentious hearing. I understand you did come from the air regulatory side of the EPA, but I suspect that we're going to spend a considerable amount of time on EPA's water regulations since they were issued just this past Tuesday that will govern the federal jurisdiction of water. These are rules that have been a long time coming, and that I do support, and I appreciate the fact that you have taken the initiative to do what has needed to be done for a very long time. I also want to congratulate you for listening to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and actually issuing a proposed rule instead of just guidance. We often heard complaints that the guidance skirted an open process afforded by rulemaking. We heard those on the floor of the House just yesterday. So hopefully that complaint is now off the table. I'm sure I don't have to remind you that EPA has done more than its share of deficit reduction. Its budget has been reduced from $10 billion in 2010 to $8.2 in FY14. It's disturbing that EPA would be the first in line for additional spending reductions, and that your request would be $7.9 billion this year with all of the environmental challenges that we have. I share the chairman's concern about the deterioration of our aged water infrastructure. So I wonder if we shouldn't have OMB up here in front of the subcommittee so that we could better understand the rationale of the administration in continuing to gut state revolving funds and to propose further staffing reductions to 1,500 full-time equivalents, 200 less than you'll have on board this year. I do appreciate your request to add over $35 million for federal and state air quality management, but we've seen what has happened to those requests in the past. The reductions you put forward are mostly accepted, and the increases are denied. So I appreciate your fiscally responsible request, but I question the ramifications that it will have for the environment. And invariably, year after year, when you propose cutting something, that's accepted. When you propose increasing something, it's rejected. But your mission remains as important as ever. While we debate over climate change in Congress, I think we should bear in mind Ronald Reagan and his leadership on getting the Montreal Protocol done with other world leaders. President Reagan had a conservative, a clear, and a successful record on deregulation. But he was spurred to action by the discovery of the hole in the ozone. And while the Montreal Protocol was meant to save the ozone layer, there are new reports now that the treaty may have been integral in slowing global warming, since some of the same chemicals cause both the hole in the ozone and global warming. Again, we have a good example of the kind of leadership that has come to the fore when necessary, facing the facts of environmental degradation. The World Health Organization concluded that in 2012, around 7 million people died as a result of air pollution exposure. We've made improvements since the Clean Air Act amendments of the 1990s, but there is so much more to do to reduce emissions of particulate matter and mercury. Now, I tried, as my friend Mr. Simpson is well aware, to establish kind of a tradition of quoting Republican presidents like Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Richard Nixon on the need to protect the environment. But it hasn't done a whit of good. Well, look at the bills. You listen, but you don't. You know. Anyways, it really doesn't seem to have produced much in the way of dividends. So I'm going to suspend this practice, even though I have a great quote from Rachel Carson. You really want the quote from? Okay. What's that, Mr. Chairman? Silent Spring. Well, yeah, the silence. The chairman clearly has read Rachel Carson, but she said that we now stand where two roads diverge, but unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have been long traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork in the road, the one less traveled by, offers our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. The point being, this is going to be tough. These regulations are going to be tough. I know you've gotten an enormous amount of pushback in your travels around the country, but the road less traveled is the one that we need to choose. So I thank you for your service and look forward to your hearing your testimony and working with you. Thank you, Administrator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. It's going to get difficult to approve that road under these new regulations. We're also joined today by our Chairman and full committee Appropriations Chairman Rogers. I thank him for taking time to contribute to this important conversation. Chairman Rogers, would you like to make a opening?
We are moving quite quickly along on the hearings this year. We've begun earlier than we ever have, to my knowledge, because we had our budget number from the budget deal, and we didn't have to wait on the Budget Committee or anyone else. So we're proceeding forthwith. I want to do 12 bills this year, and so does my counterpart in the House and the Senate. These hearings are proceeding earlier than ever and earlier than usual, certainly. So we've proven, I think, that we can get the job done if they give us the equipment to do it with. When they gave us the common number with the Senate out of the Ryan Murray budget deal, we were able to construct this committee, able to construct with the Senate that omnibus bill in 30 days, and including the two major holidays. So we can do the job, and we're proving that we can, and that's where we are now. Madam Chairman, unfortunately, I found myself at odds with your agency ever since I've been here, and certainly ever since you've been here. And that has not changed today. For years, it seems the EPA has worked hard to devise new regulations that are designed to eliminate coal mining, coal burning, usage of coal, period. And that means jobs where I live, especially in my district. There's been a relentless attack by you and your predecessors on jobs in the coal industry. Now, these are jobs that are critical to the local communities where these workers live. They're the only jobs there. I've had 8,000 of my miners laid off in the last few months. They went from a good-paying job of $80,000 to trying to find a job at McDonald's to support a family. And I don't find any heartbeat up here concerned about the well-being of these Americans. I just don't see it. I see a relentless, ongoing, continuous attack, not just from EPA, but from MSHA and all of the other agencies that have anything to do with coal mining. It's sad. It's tragic. It also makes me mad. And so don't look for any friendship out of this seat. Now, having said that, the nation needs this inexpensive electricity that comes from burning coal. You're going to have it. There's not enough wind, nor sun, nor nuclear, or natural gas, or anything else that can produce the power that's already in place by burning coal. So whether you like it or not, and I know you don't, whether you like it or not, you're going to have to use coal to keep your lights on. And so the uncertainty driven by the bureaucratic overreach that the courts have severely cautioned you on now several times, this overreach that we see coming on beats all the others at 10 lengths. You're going to push businesses overseas. We're going to have job losses, not just in the coal business, because inexpensive electricity is one of the biggest attractions America has for creating factories and jobs. And your policies are going to drive up the cost of electricity beyond belief. We almost had a burnout about a month ago with the extreme cold and the extreme weather that we were having, especially in the Northeast. The industry all but crashed that much. And you're going to see that again, except more frequently. And you're going to pay a heavy price out there in the country when your policies have caused the problems that we're going to see. But I don't see anybody in your agency that has even thought about that, or at least thinks about it, or cares about it. I was disappointed on Monday to read that the Supreme Court decided not to hear a case in which the EPA was retroactively denying permits that the Corps of Engineers had already approved years before and EPA goes back and undoes something that years before had been approved. All that does is continue the cycle of uncertainty that the industry feels, never knowing if another government bureaucrat is going to walk out of the woods to shut down a mine operation simply because he or she doesn't like coal. This comes on top of new proposals to shut down coal-fired power plants by creating standards that the EPA knows are impossible to meet with commercially available technology. This shows how serious the president is about one campaign promise of 2008 to bankrupt anyone who intends to build new coal-fired power plants. That was blatant. So we know where the policy came from. That attitude underlies nearly all of the EPA's actions. Thanks to this administration, mining permits are almost impossible to achieve. New rules have made it almost impossible to mine coal. Court decisions are summarily disregarded. And productive mines sit idle, and miners are trying to find a way to support their family. And there's no jobs there. It's time for bureaucrats to lay aside their personal animus toward this staple of the American economy and allow for all of the above energy policies which the President has paid mere lip service to. That should include coal. And it's time for the Senate to step up and pass bills, those bills to protect coal mining and energy jobs that the House has already sent to them. I'm also dismayed at this week's news that despite years of concerns expressed by this committee and others, the EPA and the Corps of Engineers are working to create new rules that will place strict new standards on thousands of miles of so-called streams in this country, even though they haven't had water in them for decades. These are streams which flow seasonally or after heavy rains, sometimes never. But by creating this new definition, the administration is again striking at Kentucky and others' economy and workforce. Every hollow and valley in my region has some sort of a stream running through it, sometimes dry or intermittent or what have you, will be under your jurisdiction. It's the biggest land grab in the history of the world. No economic activity, no road construction, no coal mining, nothing will occur on those lands without the say-so of a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. Another layer of red tape will be added to the Gordian knot that already has a stranglehold on our people since this administration declared a war on coal. This land grab with this proposed new rule is unbelievable. There are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of creeks and streams and dry beds and the like that would be subject to your oversight, where no one could do anything on those lands without getting your approval. That ain't going to happen, Madam Administrator. And right here is where a good part of the fight's going to take place in this subcommittee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we're also joined today by Ms. Loy, who's here with us as the ranking member of the full committee. Ms. Loy, do you have an opening statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Moran, welcome, Administrator McCarthy. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the first budget hearing before the Appropriations Committee. To be blunt, the FY15 budget request for the Environmental Protection Agency of $7.89 billion is unacceptable at $310 million below current levels. Last year, I voiced concern that Americans don't see the importance of EPA's work in their everyday lives. Despite existing environmental programs, the EPA's successes in improving the environment with the passage of the Clean Air Act, amendments of 1990 and the laws in 1980s, establishing the Superfund program, addressed some of the most egregious threats to our well-being. My colleagues, my friends, although we may have disagreements, forcefully attack the EPA. In my judgment, they don't value your purpose. It seems like almost every week the House votes on a bill to roll back EPA's ability to protect the environment, with Democrats overwhelmingly opposing these bills and Republicans overwhelmingly supporting them. Instead of making a full-throated defense of the EPA, this budget request seems to indicate that EPA doesn't fully value the importance of its own work in the everyday lives of Americans. I'm particularly concerned about the $580.8 million proposed cuts to the state revolving loan fund, which supports drinking water and wastewater infrastructure investments. According to the American Society for Civil Engineers in New York, which has some of the oldest infrastructure in the country, there is a $56.7 billion need over the next 20 years for drinking and wastewater upgrades. In a 2011 drinking water infrastructure survey, EPA found that nationally $384.2 billion in drinking water upgrades are needed over the next 20 years. And in 2008, EPA reported that approximately $300 billion is needed for wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. Since these surveys were completed, the price tag has likely grown, while EPA investments have declined. I'm also disappointed by cuts to the Long Island Sound, Great Lakes, staffing levels at EPA, which strongly suggests a decrease in inspection and enforcement efforts by the agency and an increase in self-regulation by industry. The recent chemical spill in West Virginia and coal ash release in North Carolina clearly demonstrate the potential dangers of self-regulation. Madam Administrator, I look forward to hearing from you about the future of EPA, and I will do everything I can to ensure that you have adequate resources when the committee writes its FY 2015 bill. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady. Thank you, and thank you again, Administrator McCarthy, for being here today to testify. Please share with us your EPA's proposed budget for FY 2015. Thank you.
Chairman Calvert, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Moran, it's great to be here, and thank you, the members of the committee, for having me here. I have an opportunity today to talk about EPA's proposed 2015 budget, and as the chairman indicated, I'm joined by the agency's acting chief financial officer, Marianne Froelich. EPA's budget request is $7.89 billion for the 2015 fiscal year starting October 1, 2014. This budget meets the challenges of domestic spending constraints while still fulfilling our mission to protect public health and the environment. The fiscal year 2015 budget reflects EPA's plan to take advantage of new technologies, new regulatory as well as non-regulatory approaches, and it recognizes that EPA is part of a larger network of environmental partners in our states, tribes, and communities. This budget will provide the support for a smaller workforce by focusing on real progress in priority areas. Those include communities, climate change and air quality, toxics and chemical safety, as well as clean water. We're asking for $7.5 million and 64 staff in fiscal year 2015 to help provide green infrastructure, technical assistance for up to 100 communities to promote cost-effective approaches for water management. In addition, the budget request continues our environmental justice efforts. We will do more to partner with states, tribes, and local governments and other federal agencies. Funding for state and tribal assistance grants, or what we call STAG, is once again the largest percentage of EPA's budget. Addressing the threat from climate change is one of the greatest challenges of this and future generations. The request designates $199.5 million specifically for this work. The agency has added $10 million and 24 FTE in fiscal year 2015 to support the President's Climate Action Plan, with $2 million designated for adaptation planning. The agency will also focus resources on the development of common sense and achievable greenhouse gas standards for power plants, the single largest source of carbon pollution. When it comes to cutting greenhouse gas emissions, the President's budget provides support for the states to help them implement the Clean Air Act. The EPA budget requests almost $673 million to support work to improve chemical safety for all Americans, and especially for our children. We're requesting $23 million and 24 FTE in fiscal year 2015 to support activities under the President's executive order on chemical safety, as well as the agency's efforts on chemical prioritization, air toxics, radon, and volatile organic compounds in drinking water. The nation's water resources are the lifeblood of our communities. We are requesting $1.775 billion for clean water and drinking water state revolving funds. The agency is also directing $8 million and 10 FTE to advance clean water infrastructure and sustainable design, like the municipal stormwater sewer programs for technical support to communities. E-Enterprise is a major joint initiative between EPA and the states to modernize our business practices, to get into the 21st century, to look at new business practices and that look towards the future. The benefits of implementing E-Enterprise can be seen in just one E-Enterprise initiative, the E-Manifest system, which includes annual savings estimated at $75 million for over 160,000 waste handlers. In fiscal year 2015, the agency is requesting over $1.33 billion to continue to apply effective approaches for cleanups under RCRA, Superfund, leaking underground storage tank, and other programs. This strategy will ensure land is returned to beneficial use. $1.16 billion is requested for Superfund, which includes a $43.4 million increase for remedial work and an increase of $9.2 million for emergency response and removal. The FY 2015 budget includes a total of $1.13 billion in categorical grants. Within that total is over $96 million for tribal general assistance programs, an $18 million increase for pollution control, a $16 million increase for environmental information grants, and a $15 million increase for state and local air quality management. Science is the foundation of our work at EPA, and science is supported by the President's request of $537.3 million. And lastly, across the administration, we recognize the importance of the two-year budget agreement Congress reached in December. But the resulting funding levels are insufficient to expand opportunities to all Americans that really drive the growth of our economy in the way that we all know is necessary. For that reason, across the federal government, the budget also includes a separate, fully paid $56 billion initiative. And within that initiative is a climate resilience fund, which includes $10 million for protecting and enhancing coastal wetlands and $5 million to support urban forest enhancement and protection. Chairman Calvert, I thank you for the opportunity to testify and to take your questions.
I thank the Administrator. Before I recognize the full committee chairman, I want to make a point, Administrator McCarthy. It's one thing to share two different perspectives on a policy. It's another thing to, I believe, mislead the public, and I believe the talking points drafted by your agency describe Tuesday's navigable water announcement are patently false. I couldn't disagree with your statement that, quote, the proposed rule will not add or expand the scope of waters historically protected under the Clean Water Act, unquote. This proposal is the greatest expansion on federal control over land and water resources in the 42-year history of the Clean Water Act. The amount of acreage subject to EPA's jurisdiction will expand exponentially as more waterways are subject to permitting. It's the biggest bureaucratic power grab that I've seen and should make every landowner fearful that the EPA will be knocking on the door with an enforcement action. The amount of uncertainty and lack of prepared cost estimates that come with this ruling are alarming. EPA claims that the rule provides more certainty, but it sounds like the certainty comes in the form of more mandatory permits and more jurisdictional waterways. And with that, I recognize the Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that that sentiment expressed in your statement, which is exactly correct. This is the biggest land grab in the history of any governmental agency, in the history of mankind, really. And the Supreme Court has, the courts have stricken down several EPA overreaches, and this one, I think, is ripe for the picking, and I think the courts will say, as we say, you completely overreached beyond your legal authority given to you by the Congress. And we'll see about that as time passes. Just yesterday, the EPA and the Corps announced they're working together on this new regulation system for what's called Waters of the United States, which would greatly expand by, as the chairman says, exponentially, the miles of waterway that you would have jurisdiction over, including thousands of miles of streams that are considered intermittent, seasonal, rain-dependent. In essence, you're saying that you would have authority over streams on private property even when there are not streams. That is proof in and of itself of the malintent of this administration toward the private sector. The economic impact of that could be profound, would be profound. A community needing to build on private land that had on it one of these so-called streams that you considered a waterway under the new rule would have to travel thousands, hundreds of miles to D.C. to get your approval, you and the Corps. It would absolutely freeze economic activity in this country. No more stores or shopping centers or any kind of improvement of a property would be subject to your approval, even when some of these streams, so-called streams, had not seen water in 1,000 years. When the courts and the Congress have said navigable streams, what does that mean? It means a place you can navigate, which means traveling in water. But when there's no water, how can it be navigable? And where it's not seen water in 1,000 years, how can you call that a stream? I think the courts are going to scream that your definition of stream is way overboard. How much time would it take for a entity to go through the individual permitting process in this kind of a situation?
Is that a question for me, sir?
How long would it take a community to go through the individual permitting process?
This rule actually doesn't impact the permit process itself, and in fact, we think it provides certainty to decrease the amount of time when you're in question as to whether you need a permit, and to decrease the amount of time you need to get through the permit process.
But you're talking about almost permitting the whole doggone country.
No, sir, we're not expanding the types of waters that we have traditionally and historically been regulating.
Well, in my district alone, there are literally thousands of these so-called streams that you would now assert jurisdiction over. How is it that a private property owner would know whether or not they needed your approval?
Well, sir, that's exactly the question that this proposed rule is attempting to answer based on science and the law.
If a private property owner takes some measure on his or her own land to mitigate flooding from a seasonal stream, or repair a bridge that their driveway is across, would they now have to apply for a permit under this so-called rule?
Well, actually, one of the things we're doing with this proposal, and one of the reasons why we made the switch from a guidance to a proposal, is to try to better define the waters that are non-jurisdictional and to be much clearer about what is jurisdictional. And there are seasonal streams where the science is telling us that they're very important to maintain the integrity of navigable waters, which is what the Supreme Court in unanimity told us in 1985 was the purpose of our act, and that we had to clarify that for implementation purposes. So all we're doing with this, sir, is trying to clarify that. And it's, again, a proposal. We did the best we could. We've expanded the exemptions that we've defined, and we've been much clearer about the science on how we can protect navigable waters, which is the purpose of the Clean Water Act.
Now, you say that that you're following science,
Yes,
that you're being ruled by the science,
yes,
and that determines where you're going with the rule.
yes.
Well, if the science is so airtight on this rule, why is it that the scientific assessment that you use to back it up is only in draft form?
The Science Advisory Board has been asked to do a peer review of a consolidation of a number of peer-reviewed articles for the certainty of the general public, and that will be finalized before this rule is final so that we can take their final input into consideration. But we know that every piece of science that we are looking at underpinning this has already been appropriately peer-reviewed. But we felt, for certainty purposes, to support this rule, to let every one of you know that we're following the science the best we could, that we should consolidate it and ask our Science Advisory Board to look at that consolidated process in a transparent, open, public comment process.
Well, your so-called scientific assessment that you rely upon
Yes.
is not even in final form. I mean, it still could be changed, and yet you're proposing the rule and the 90-day hearing before you even give us the final science paper upon which you base your proposed rule. Wouldn't it stand to reason on such a wide-ranging regulation as this is, that's revolutionary, would it not be the thing to do to have the scientific basis settled in final form so all of us can see it and know about it and study it and analyze it before you propose the rule?
As I've said before, Mr. Chairman, the rule will, the connectivity report will be finalized, and we'll consider that before the rule is final. But the reason we're doing this is because we think and we know there's tremendous uncertainty. There's money being expended that doesn't need to be expended. There is concern in the agriculture community that we haven't properly identified agricultural practices that were and remain exempt under this law. So the sooner we can provide the clarity, the sooner we think that the Clean Water Act will work effectively, and we'll be able to have certainty in the regulated community, and we'll all be able to move forward knowing we're doing what the law requires us to do, but in the most cost-effective and sensitive way that we can.
I would have thought you would have wanted to wait on the settled science before you moved ahead, putting everything sort of in jeopardy because no one knows how that scientific assessment may finally turn out.
Well, we will take that into consideration, sir, but it's a belt and suspender approach, and we know that we're basing this proposal on what we believe to be the best science available, and it's all been properly peer-reviewed. But again, it's a starting point.
Well,
what I'd encourage you to do is to just take a look at how hard we tried to define what's in and what's out, and to propose alternatives to think about how we could do this better together.
Wouldn't it be smart to entrust the science of this to an agency like the
National Academy.
National Academy of Science, whose objective would be trusted, I think, by everyone. Would it not have been smart to get the Academy of Science approval of this, or at least an analysis, before you propose the rule and start the 90-day public comment period?
Well, Mr. Chairman, this is a 42-year-old law where its jurisdiction is up in the air. That does not mean that we don't have a wealth of science that already can be used to underpin and provide clarity for the implementation of this 42-year-old law. We have been approached by every sector of the economy, that may be a slight exaggeration, maybe not all, but many, who have been struggling with trying to get the permits they need to keep the economy moving and do the work that's so precious to you.
We've heard
and
from
we
the
want to
same-
provide clarity.
We've heard from the same people, and they're in an uproar around the country at this proposal. We're going to hear a lot more from people who are directly affected by this and negatively affected. Let me ask you, somebody's going to have to do a map of where these so-called streams that you're asserting jurisdiction over are, right?
We actually have some mapping in the docket associated with this rule that people can access at this point. One of the reasons why we wanted to do a rulemaking is it provides us an opportunity to hear from people. I do think people have concerns, and I want to hear about that.
Where are the maps that you have?
You can access them through in the EPA webpage, which is www.epa.gov.
I'm not going to ask anybody. I want you to deliver it to us.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. Now, what's going to be the costs of mapping out where these new streams are? There's tens of thousands of them that would be covered by your rule. How are we going to pay for, and who's going to do the mapping, and what's it going to cost?
Well, the challenge that we've had, sir, is that there's been no mapping before, there's been no certainty. So we are identifying the rivers and streams and tributaries and other water bodies that science tells us is really necessary to protect the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our navigable waters. We have taken an opportunity to map those. We're certain we'll get comment on them. But the point we're trying to make is there are other waters where there is uncertainty. But the more we can make bake certainty into this process, the better off we'll be able to send the right signals to the business community and to our agriculture community.
What's going to cost?
There is a cost analysis that's in the rule. It looks at both direct and indirect costs, but frankly, the costs of the uncertainty at this point, I believe, is much larger than the cost of bringing certainty to this issue.
What is the
This
cost
not an
of mapping the program?
Oh,
Cost.
I can look that up for you, sir, but the indirect benefits are larger than the direct.
What is the cost of
direct
doing the
cost.
mapping that would implement this rule?
I'm not aware that we need to expend costs on mapping at this point, sir.
Well, who's going to do the mapping?
EPA has already provided some maps that we can comment on, and we'll look at those and see what people think about those and whether or not there
You're
needs to be
expanding your
additional
jurisdiction here by
clarification.
tens of thousands of so-called streams in all 50 states, which is a huge undertaking. And you're saying it's not going to cost anything extra to do that?
Sir, we do not believe that we are expanding the reach of the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act beyond its historic waters.
If these, if your agency personnel, you say, are the ones who will do the mapping, and that you won't need any additional personnel or money, what have these people been doing before now? Because this is going to be a huge undertaking.
No, sir, we're trying to provide a definition for what is a water of the U.S. so that we can protect our navigable waters. We believe that definition will provide clarity, that you'll understand what waters are in or out better than ever before. We've looked at expanding the exemptions so that we can provide more certainty to the agriculture community. That's what this proposed regulation is all about.
Now, suppose a community defies the agency, maybe unknowingly, and violates the rule. What's the penalty? What would that community pay in the way of a penalty, or a person?
That process will not change that as it is currently, which is we work with people beforehand, we try to understand what the challenge is, and we mitigate it. The opportunity we have here is to make sure that people understand what their obligations are without the complexity that's in the system now. We think this will allow people to comply more readily, to understand what their obligation is, and to avoid the confusion and the confrontation.
What's the penalty if somebody violates the rule?
It would be the same penalty as prior to this.
Which is what?
I can't specifically say. It all depends on the interaction with the individual that's in question, how we can work together. There are many where no penalty is assessed, and there are others where there are large penalties assessed.
Well,
it all depends on the case, sir, and the willingness of the parties to work together. And EPA certainly wants to resolve
This is pretty
these
simple.
issues.
It's a simple question. A community violates the rule, crosses over a so-called stream that you have jurisdiction over. Maybe they don't know that it's ruled by you. Nevertheless, they've violated the rule. What do they pay?
It all depends on the circumstance, sir. We certainly
give me
work
a
with
break.
people.
We've got, surely you can, it's a pretty simple question, pretty simple case.
But we don't like to assess a formula. We like to understand the circumstance and work with the individuals. That's how we do our business.
Well, you're doing your business pretty well. You're grinding to a halt the economic engine of this country. No wonder we're having trouble getting the economy going again. It's sluggish, terribly sluggish for years now. And I think a major part of it is the regulations and the fear of this agency that you had that is depressing the business climate in this country. And this rule that you're proposing would magnify that by 100. So mark me down as undecided.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Recognize the ranking member for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the most significant opportunities to address climate change in the near term is the phase-out of HCFCs, which are harmful to the ozone, 1,800 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. The EPA recently issued a proposed rule setting virgin HCFC production levels for 2015 to 19, the final years of the phase-out. I'm frankly disappointed the EPA was not more aggressive. Given the significant existing stockpiles of virgin HCFC, the unmet capacity of the reclamation industry, and the widespread availability of alternative refrigerants, why is EPA proposing an additional 90 million pounds of virgin production over the next 5 years? The environmental community, key industry stakeholders, including the major producers, have urged the EPA to be more aggressive. Will you take another look at the proposal and consider a more aggressive phase-out?
Congressman, thank you for raising the question. I agree with you that it's extremely important. The U.S. is on track of meeting the phase-out goals in the Montreal Protocol, but we certainly know, and we've done before, that we can do better all the time. We did put a proposal out in December, and the comment period just closed, so we're really concerned, and I'm concerned about not making a judgment prior to taking a look at those comments and moving forward with the final. But we share your concern, and we want to make sure that we're as aggressive as we can be while recognizing that some of these chemicals need to be in continued use because of already existing residential air conditioners that rely on these. We want to make sure that the economy, particularly of our homes, don't be impacted unnecessarily by a phase-out like this.
So you're still looking at it?
We are, yes.
One of the EPA's goals is to create a supply gap to grow the reclamation industry.
Yes, yes.
Yet that gap has never been created. Every year, EPA allocations have exceeded demand, leading to a substantial stockpile. As I understand it, this rule is our last chance to get this right. So I do hope you're going to
I'll take
review
a
it
close
very
look at
carefully and take another look. One other question. The EPA's FY15 request decreases funding for the Long Island Sound by $1.047 million, or roughly 25% cut from the FY14 enacted level. More than 10% of our nation's population lives in the Long Island Sound watershed, and the Sound contributes an estimated $8.9 billion per year to the regional economy from commercial and recreational fishing, ecotourism, and other water-dependent businesses. Congress has also recognized its importance with two authorizations that support up to $65 million in annual investment, and according to EPA's Long Island Sound study, the Sound is an excellent steward of taxpayer dollars, leveraging every $1 of EPA investment into $70 in other federal, state, local, and private partner funding. Why does the administration continue to propose budgets that underfund a watershed that 1 out of 10 Americans call home?
Well, Congresswoman, you probably know that Long Island Sound is one of my favorite water bodies, having worked in Connecticut for 5 years and with the Long Island study. It's an amazing group. I agree with you. They do great work with the money. The proposal in the President's budget this year is the same level as we proposed in 2014, but I do recognize that Congress did add or direct another $1 million to that fund. I certainly respect their decision. All things being equal about the budget constraints we're facing, I agree with you. It's a wonderful investment, but we had to make some tough choices, and hopefully we are sending a signal about the importance of Long Island Sound with the funding level that we've proposed.
Well, thank you very much, and I know we'll work together to make sure that we continue that important work. And
We will.
It is so essential, and the Long Island Sound study has made some very important investments with important results. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the support.
Thank the gentlelady. Administrator McCarthy, I was listening to your testimony and some of the questions that the chairman was asking about certainty. And just from listening to that conversation, it seems to me that the only certainty that comes from this is a form of more mandatory permits for the jurisdictional waterways that will be administered through this new rule. Already, home builders are announcing that the backlogs will increase by thousands and thousands of homes. Farmers are fearful. We're hearing from farm groups throughout the United States about uncertainties regarding agricultural exemptions. They say it's not so farm-friendly as the statements that have been made by your administration. And further, the issue that was brought up about the study not being finalized is going to obviously bring up more questions as this process of peer review goes forward. I chaired the Environment Committee many years ago on the authorization side, so I know how this works. And by starting the clock before the science has been completed is a way to jumpstart this process before the right questions should be asked. So I'm very concerned about why we're moving in this direction so quickly without the science being completely done at this point. I have just some questions from your perspective. How would you define ephemeral? What do you mean by ephemeral? What do you believe the definition of ephemeral is?
Well, there's a lot of, if you're relating to the types of decisions that the science is pointing to in the connectivity report, it's talking about streams and tributaries that may only run seasonally on certain
So
events.
these are
not
these are
permanently
non-blue
flowing
line,
waters.
these are non-blue line streams as per the core maps as they are outlined,
not-
or USGS maps as they're prepared today.
I'm sorry, I'm not that familiar with the extent of USGS mapping, so I'm not trying
Well,
to
they-
avoid the
Traditionally, the
question.
404 permitting process is, by the Corps, has been defined down to what we would refer to as a blue line stream on a
Yep.
map. So this is going to expand that, isn't that correct?
For the most part, I believe these are the types of waters that we actually have been considering as waters of the U.S. and jurisdictional.
Then you wouldn't need to have a new rule if, in fact, it wasn't going to be expanded.
Well, it's to provide clarity, sir. I mean, we want people to know what rivers and streams, whether they run full-time or part-time, are important to protect navigable waters. That's what this is all about.
So whether they run full-time or part-time will be under the jurisdiction of the EPA?
Well, no, well, it's always been that many of the streams that have been under the jurisdiction of the waters of the U.S. have not run 24/7.
So states who have had dry stream beds, as the chairman pointed out, sometimes for years or months, are now, that have not been considered under the jurisdiction of the Environmental Protection Agency, nor the Corps of Engineers, will now be under that jurisdiction. Isn't that correct?
No, I don't believe that's true.
Isn't that what the rule said? I read it very carefully.
Yeah, no, the rule indicated that we're providing clarity on what's under the jurisdiction, and if I could, we're following exactly what the Supreme Court told us from 1985 all the way to a few years ago when it got very confusing. They told us it's not just about navigable waters, it's about all of those water bodies that significantly impact, or that can significantly impact the integrity of those navigable waters.
I read Justice Kennedy's
Yes.
decision, which wasn't exactly very clarifying in my mind. But nonetheless, I don't think you made
Which
it
is-
any
which is
more
why we
clear.
do- we
I don't
did-
think
we're
you made it
doing
any
this rule.
clearer in this rule. What is intermittent? How do you define intermittent?
It doesn't run 24/7.
It doesn't run 24/7. So
What you're defining is...
how do you
the
define
demands are-
24/7? I mean, is it 24 hours? Is it a
No,
month?
it
Is
relates to a
year?
significant nexus. What the Supreme Court, not just Justice Kennedy said, but the Supreme Court said that it's about waters that have a significant nexus to navigable waters.
Well,
That's what we're trying to
Let me
get.
ask a yes or no question. If a stream bed has been dry for a year, was that under your jurisdiction?
I can't answer that question, yes or no.
That
I
doesn't create
can't- I
any
believe-
certainty.
Well, actually, the waters of the U.S. go into great lengths about talking about this, about providing
Is that
certainty, about
navigable?
talking about the science.
So that defines as navigable waters this dry stream bed?
No, of course it wouldn't, no. But this is not just about navigable waters. In 1985, the entire Supreme Court
So
was
you
unanimous in telling us that it wasn't just
that is
navigable.
a significant federal nexus? This dry stream bed is a significant
No, what
federal
determines a significant, a significant connection is having a hydrological connection and having a potential to significantly impact the integrity of the navigable waters below.
nexus. So that would be any
Not at all.
Any potential waterway,
Not at
any
all.
dry. I wonder if some of our environmental friends in the audience would believe that to be the case.
Well, I
And
think
going
we
to
tried to
court-
go to great
Going to
lengths, sir.
court to redefine what the true meaning of federal nexus or navigable waters or tributaries or ephemeral. This expanded jurisdiction, from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of many people in this country, is not going to create certainty. But with that, I'll be happy to recognize the ranking member of the committee.
Mr.
Moran?
Calvert, can I just say that, 117 million people rely on their drinking water supplies from streams that don't run full-time. So we have to recognize that there is a level of judgment that needs to be made. What we're trying to do is use the science to help make that judgment.
And I suspect EPA was going to make that judgment. Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Ranking Member Moran?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do want to get on to the record the other side here, because there's a substantial body of opinion and judgment and industry that feels this is the right thing, right and necessary thing to do. And in fact, some feel it doesn't go far enough. The environmental community wanted a specific expansion of water jurisdiction, because about 60% of the miles that make up U.S. streams only flow seasonally or after rain. Now, the president of Trout Unlimited, Chris Wood, and I'm quoting him, said, "Today's proposal speaks to the heart of the Clean Water Act, making rivers more fishable and more swimmable. The waters affected by today's proposal provide vital spawning and rearing habitat for trout and salmon. Simply stated, the proposal will make fishing better and anglers should support it." Now, the intermittent and ephemeral streams provide critical fish habitat, particularly out west. They account for 94% of Arizona's streams, 88% of New Mexico's. They provide the flow for the larger rivers and the rearing habitat for young fish and insects, and they help to determine, they really do determine the quality of downstream habitat for fish. So this new proposal also exempts farmers who are undertaking even one of the 53 approved conservation measures from having to seek a federal discharge or a fill permit. Now, Whit Fosberg, who's the president of the nonprofit Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, these are a lot of hunting and fishing organizations, he was quoted saying, "Headwater streams, that's where all the fish come from, all of them spawn in headwater streams triggered by snow melt and other runoff. We'll hear a lot about the economic impact of this clean water rule, but hunting and fishing is a $2 billion a year enterprise. It generates more than $125 million in state and federal taxes." He's in favor of this rule. He applauded the EPA and the Corps of Engineers, and he says, and this is what we're hearing from others, we actually wanted to make it even stronger. So now let me get to the question here, Madam Administrator, because in listening to the debate, you keep saying that the jurisdiction of waters covered under federal jurisdiction has not changed. So then we have to ask, what's the point of proposing a new rule? Now, to the full committee chairman's example of penalties, can you describe if the penalties for a company that we have shown, proven, has dumped toxic waste into rivers, say, for example, through mountaintop mining removal, if they've dumped toxic waste into rivers, could they have to pay the same penalty under current guidance as they would under this proposed rule? What would be the difference?
There's no change.
No change.
No.
So will this proposed rule require EPA to go out and take action against a company who is dumping toxic waste into the water without a permit? Because most of them have not gotten permits that we find, and yet we find an awful lot of toxic waste as a result of this mining practice. If they is it going to require you to go out and take action against them if they did not have a permit for dumping into water, or if they dumped in excess of the permit they hold?
It adds no new requirements. However, we're hoping that with this information, they'll be able to understand their obligation and avoid those circumstances.
So it's a clarification, really. It is not a change in your regulatory authority, and they would still could be held liable, but this is telling them in advance what they would be responsible for. Well, it seems like that's what the realtors had been requesting in the beginning. We were getting letters saying we need clarification on this. Now, I understand they're not particularly happy about this, and that they will be providing input into the rulemaking process. But that, from what I understand, is your intent in issuing these regulations to achieve clarity.
And our intent is to listen to the comments from everyone who feels that this could be improved between proposal and final. That's our goal.
All right. Thank you, Madam Administrator. Just so that we understand, there are other issues, too, in this bill. I would like to raise another issue. I wasn't even going to get into the clean water, but I thought it appropriate, given the fact that that seems to have been our emphasis. But I want to ask you about atrazine.
Yes.
There's been an evaluation of atrazine. It goes back to, there was a formal study in 2003. There's been about 150 published studies now with regard to human health. And it's pretty well documented that it is a severe threat to human health in drinking water and other bodies of water. Intersex or hermaphroditism, we know, is a condition where living species, specifically male fish, have developed ovaries and female fish have developed male organs. They are being found in alarmingly higher numbers in lakes and rivers across the United States. And apparently the phenomenon isn't related to fish. Just last month I read an article in the New Yorker on the chemical atrazine. You read it too. I'm glad you did. It's a widely used pesticide for corn and sorghum and sugarcane. This researcher, Tyrone Hayes, found that the condition of hermaphroditism was induced in frogs by exposure to atrazine at levels that were 30 times below what EPA allows in water. He found that the frogs born male turned into infertile female frogs after exposure to atrazine. Then there was substantial industry pressure, and in 2003, EPA allowed the continued use of atrazine at the same time that the European Commission chose to remove it from the market. So we had these documented studies. The EU removed it from the market, and we chose to continue the use of it. Now, it's more than 10 years later, and EPA has still not followed suit to remove the pesticide from the market, even though the maker of the pesticide agreed to pay $105 million to reimburse more than 1,000 water systems for the cost of filtering atrazine from drinking water because of their concern over liability as a result of proven atrazine-induced illnesses and birth defects. So I want to know from you, what does EPA know that the European Union does not know, or the reverse? What information are they using for action and we are not?
Well, Congressman, I'm glad you've raised this issue because I read the same article and I sort of knocked on people's doors myself. And our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention has spent several years peer reviewing the science related to atrazine, both the human health and the ecological, as you've mentioned. Next year, we're going to have a preliminary risk assessment that we're going to make public. And we expect in 2016 we'll make some final decisions on the basis of that. So we are taking a comprehensive review of these, the science, and we're hopefully going to be moving in an expedited way to answer the questions that you've raised.
Good for you. Well, I've got a host of other questions, but we've got a lot of members here, so I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thanks, the gentleman. By the way, just before I recognize Mr. Simpson, I just want to interject that you're going to submit a map that shows the expansion of your jurisdiction for the record.
I will submit the maps that we've provided on the docket, sir, sure.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator McCarthy, thanks for being here today. First, let me say, and I haven't said this publicly, I guess, is to thank you for the work we did with small refineries and the problem that they had, and when you were administrator of the AIR program, we brought them all together and talked with the Small Business Administration and so forth, and you went back to work and solved the problem. I certainly appreciate it. And as much criticism as the EPA takes from me and everyone else, you've got good people working out in the Pacific Northwest. We don't always agree on everything, but they work with us and trying to solve problems. And Dennis McLaren is doing a great job at Region 10, and we enjoy working with him. Having said that, I know you talk about certainty and wanting to create certainty with the change in the rules, the NAV water rules, and I understand that Mr. Moran likes the rules and stuff. And I got to tell you, in all honesty, if you want to regulate every drop of water that falls on the state of Virginia, I don't care. If you want to have a permit when Mr. Moran flushes his toilet, I don't care. But I can tell you just kind of fired I can tell you just fired the first shot across the bow in the West, because we see this as a war. Water is obviously vitally important in Idaho. And we know that we're trying to create certainty, but I tell you what, I think you've created more uncertainty than certainty. Connectivity is about as loose a term as navigable. And I know the courts have said a variety of things. One of them is in the Swank and the Rapinos decisions. The court said that the Corps and the EPA had gone too far, and that federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act is not as broad as has been claimed. Can you tell it, and to be consistent with those Supreme Court decisions, then any new rule would necessarily have to leave to the states state regulation of some waters previously regulated by the federal government. Are there any federally regulated waters now that will not be regulated by the federal government, that will be regulated by the states under this new rule?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow the question. Yeah, too many.
Supreme Court said that the Army Corps and the EPA had gone too far in interpretation of the Clean Water Act.
That is right.
So it would necessarily follow that if that were the case, there would be some waters that you had regulated before.
Yes.
And I have to remind everyone that just because the EPA or the Army Corps doesn't regulate something under the Clean Water Act doesn't mean it's not regulated. States regulate it.
Right.
So you would think under that decision that under this new rule there would be some waters that are currently regulated by the EPA that would then devolve to the state regulation if you had gone too far before.
Correct.
Are there any regulated waters that will devolve to the state regulation?
That actually happened right after that decision, sir. What they told us to do was that we couldn't just rely on ecological evidence of birds using an isolated wetland or water body, that we had to actually do the science to understand this significant nexus between a water and the impact on navigable waters below. That's exactly what this does, is it tries to identify those connections in the significant nexus exactly the way we said. And it leaves these isolated wetlands for case-by-case decisions that states will get involved in and others. But it exactly tries to do what the Supreme Court told us to do.
Could you tell me why you decided to issue this rule? Now, it's probably not true that you did this 2 days before your testimony in order to take the attention off of everything else in the budget.
I don't think that's possible.
I'm just kidding
if I
when I
could
say
have,
that.
maybe.
Because obviously a lot of this hearing is going to be on this. But could you tell me why you issued this rule, or proposed rule, prior to getting the result of the Science Advisory Board? It tells me two things, or at least this is what comes to my mind, and I'm sure everyone out there's mind, is the one, you don't care what the Science Advisory Board says, or two, you already know what they're going to say.
Well, we have moved forward because of the uncertainty that has hindered the implementation of the Clean Water Act, and I think cost everybody a lot of money. But what I want to just remind you, sir, is that the science underpinning this study is all peer-reviewed, underpinning our proposed rule, is all peer-reviewed science. What we did was to create another level of analysis to look at the consolidated peer review science.
But-
We've already
but
done
understand,
that. We proposed it, and we will not finalize this until we get the final word and consider.
But you're going
what the
out for a
Science
90-day,
Advisory Board
90
said.
days of public hearing. And
We
the
will.
public has not seen the results of this Science Advisory Board's review.
It's the same science that underpins this, so that
So we don't really
have the
need to do
science
that because
available.
you already know the results of what the Science Advisory Board is going
It's
to
a
say.
belt and suspender approach, the way I think that everybody would like us to do, is you check and you double check, and that's what this is about.
But before you go out and ask for the public comment on it, and you expect the public to give legitimate comment, I would expect that they would be able to look at the Science Advisory Board's review and say, yeah, you know, they've done a good job here, or this is nuts. But they won't have that.
They will actually be able to comment to the Science Advisory Board strictly on the science, and they'll be able to comment on ours on both the science as well as our application of the science to the policy and regulatory decisions we need to make.
Is that the 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay, we'll have another round after votes.
Yes, we will. Ms. McCollum?
Should I pack a bag?
Yeah. It's going to be a long day.
Administrator McCarthy, let me thank you and your staff for the work that you're doing and for being here today and taking all these questions. The primary agency responsibility is for implementing our nation's environmental laws. The EPA has a critical mission to improve our ability to protect our nation's human health and the environment. You have been forced to make tough decisions in this budget request, and I believe in large part because your agency is under attack. The EPA is already operating at dangerously underfunded levels and is significantly understaffed. The number of full-time employees is lower now than any time since the 1980s. This is putting the health and safety of Americans at risk. One example is the cuts to the clean and safe drinking water state revolving funds, which you've heard many of us comment on. It is clear that these budget and staffing cuts are harming the agency's ability to fulfill its core mission of protecting our nation's water. One thing that has really come to the attention of many Americans is the New York Times recently reported the nation's largest utility company, Duke Energy, had an uncontrolled spill of 39,000 tons of coal ash, which affected 70 miles of stream into the Dan River in North Carolina. And if that wasn't enough, Duke Energy knowingly pumped as much as 21 million gallons of coal ash water over several months into Cape Fear River. Now, for those who might not know what's in coal ash, it's highly radioactive. It includes arsenic, lead, mercury, and other heavy metals, which are very dangerous to human health, as well as many other environmental consequences from this ash being released. Now, we've also, just this year, heard what happened to the residents in West Virginia, 300,000 residents who had their water contaminated by a chemical spill. And to date, they are still unable to drink tap water. So America's Environmental Protection Agency needs to be able to clearly have what it needs to do its job and ensure that we enforce regulations and ensure that we have air that we can breathe safely and water that we can drink. Now, America's Clean Water and Clean Air Agency, as I can't stress enough, needs to have the resources it needs to do its job. So one question that I have is, when should we be able to expect during this year your ruling and how you're going to implement the issue of coal ash, and what other core functions are being threatened or delayed or in fact eliminated because of budget and staff cuts at the EPA? You can't just do it without the resources.
Well, I think the President's budget request is really respecting the bipartisan agreement that was reached, the Murray-Ryan agreement, and we are doing our best to take advantage in this budget proposal of all the latest technologies and tools and monitoring equipment available so we can try to do our jobs effectively, recognizing that there are always going to be budget limitations. In terms of the coal ash rule, what we call the, what do we call it? Coal combustion residual rule. I knew that. It's actually by agreement going to be finalized at the end of this year in December. I know it's a rule that's been long awaited, but that rule isn't the answer to all of the challenges that we have been seeing. There are many ways in which we need to assess the kind of emergencies we're responding to. One of the things I'd like to point out in the budget is we are requesting a little bit of a bump up in our emergency response funding and our cleanup and remediation funds for exactly this reason. We are seeing some challenges, and we'll be working with the states
Well,
to
Ms.
try to
McCarthy,
prevent those
then the
from
U.S. taxpayers cleaning up Duke Energy's mess, Duke Energy's pollution, Duke Energy's threat to clean, safe drinking water.
happening. Yeah.
So when this rule comes out at the end of the year, from then until the end of the year, they're still up to doing their own self-regulation. And if this rule is challenged, will U.S. taxpayers continue to be on the hook?
Yeah, we're not just relying on the rule, Congresswoman, and I'm not suggesting I have all the answers here, but when the spill happened in the Tennessee Valley, if you remember that spill of coal that happened, the agency did an assessment of all of the structural integrity of numbers of impoundments at these facilities. We worked with the states, we provided the information. We're not just relying on this rulemaking. And in the case of Duke, we've been working to support the North Carolina, the state, in the environmental agency, and we're working with them to take a look at all of the Duke facilities in North Carolina because concerns have been expressed. So every time we can, we're going to support the efforts of the states. We're going to be looking systemically at some of these problems when the resources are available to us. But you are not incorrect that nobody can do it all. But we're not just trying to respond to a spill. We're trying to understand what tools are available to us to prevent that from happening.
Could you, part of what Ranking Member Lowy was talking about was the inability to really get some of these appliances out of the market, which are causing great havoc in our air. There was, when I was on the Government Reform Committee, we had a hearing in which we found out, quite surprisingly, that China was allowed to continue to import air conditioners that had fluorocarbons in that. Has that changed? Are you looking at that?
We have developed rulemaking that does not allow, and I can get back to you to make sure that I'm as clear as I can on this. We are looking, and we do check, working with customs for the appliances that are coming in. And I believe we have closed that loophole, but let me not say that with such definition. Let me get back to you. I understand the question that you've asked. I believe we've taken care of it, but I want to confirm.
I would appreciate it because I was quite shocked because I worked in the private sector and I watched how, refrigerators and freezers and, car manufacturers and everybody in America got on board to do it.
Yeah.
And to find out when I got here to Congress that there was a loophole for Chinese air conditioners was just unbelievable to me. I hope we've closed that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Gentlelady. Ms. Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Madam Chair, or excuse me, Administrator McCarthy, I apologize. I have a couple of questions with regard to the carbon neutrality of biomass. I'm from Washington State. We have a lot of woody biomass, and despite a really hard hit in the last 20 years, Southwest Washington still has a tremendous interdependence on our forests.
Yeah.
And as you know, and you've talked a lot about science, and I agree that science should really drive our forest policy, our critical habitat policy, our policy with regard to protecting the forests and the people and the families who depend on the forests. And studies have shown that if forest product manufacturing residuals are not used for energy, the alternative, they just lay there and die. They emit methane, which is more, it actually would release more greenhouse gases than using that felled tree or the woody biomass on the forest floor for energy production. It's actually, methane is 24 times more potent than CO2. And I believe the science shows, I think a review of the science out there would show that the biomass manufacturing residuals are more carbon neutral than letting it just die. We should use that energy, is my point, and it's beneficial. And with that, I know that there have been setbacks in the process, but what's the timing of the EPA's revised accounting framework for the biogenetic CO2 emissions?
Well, first of all,
Biogenic,
thank you.
I'm sorry,
Thank you
my
for
coffee's
raising
not-
it. It's okay, it's biogenic.
Thank you.
The decision that you're asking us to make is one that we're pretty anxious to make, because we know there's a lot of confusion. I've had recent meetings with NFPA and others. The companies that I've been meeting with, they're really terrific. They've provided us great information. We're also using the Science Advisory Board on this issue as well to try to identify how you would provide incentives for the continued use of biomass that's being done sustainably, and there's a great deal of it. Where, on the whole, if you look at it, it's very good from a greenhouse gas perspective. The challenge is to put that into a framework that allows us to continue with the type of exemption we had before that the courts have now overturned, but to understand how we can look at biomass in the context not just of greenhouse gas permitting, but on the whole, to encourage the kind of sustainability that we're seeing out there.
Well,
We are moving forward to try to frame that up
Do
so
you
that
see
we
that
can get
happening?
something done.
Do you see any kind of timeline?
I'm hoping that I'm hoping that it'll be done this year.
Okay.
It's a very difficult science challenge, but we are not in a different place in terms of how we perceive the challenge and the intended outcome.
And I just think it's going to make there'll be it's going to be less foliage for catastrophic wildfires. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
lot of opportunities there.
There's a lot of reasons why it's a very good thing.
And the one last thing, last year I asked your predecessor this question, and I need an answer.
Okay.
Washington State was given the Western Washington storm actually, not even the whole state. The Western Washington EPA was told you have to live under, they released, it's called the Western Washington Stormwater Manual, and they derive their power from the Clean Water Act. I mean, this ended up in one of my largest counties being told you can't wash your cars in your driveway. It was during a contentious governor's race. The governor rescinded it. But as we got into it, the manual says that development can, if you're going to develop something, you're going to build a road, city got ARA funds and they have to permit a throughway. If you're going to do that, your mitigation has to be equal to pre-Lewis and Clark water runoff. We have no idea how to do that. And it continues to be the bedrock foundation for the Western Washington Stormwater Manual. King County, Puget Sound has exempted itself, but the rest of us have to develop to this standard. I asked your predecessor if he was aware of this rule, where it came, because they all point back to you. And I actually believe it's the state that is
Not me
doing
personally, right?
the EPA. They say it's because they derive it from the Clean Water Act. They say it's a federal regulation. We have to do it. And I come back and I say, well, I haven't found that here.
Okay.
I would like clarification from your office to the committee specifically whether or not they have the authority to do that based on your interpretation of the Clean Water Act, or all I just need to know is it the state choosing to do this?
Yeah.
Or are they accurate in saying you're giving the authority? And you don't have to answer that here because clearly you have no
I
idea what
apologize
I'm
if
talking
we
about.
haven't provided you a response. We'll take care
I
of it.
just need to know whose authority is it? Because I don't think they're on, but I need
Okay.
confirmation from you. So with that, thank
Happy
you,
to
Mr.
do
Chairman.
Ms. Pingree.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presence here this morning, for the work that you do at the EPA. I know there's a lot of contentious issues here today, and I appreciate your steadfast participation in this. I need to ask you first about a very parochial issue in my district, but it affects a lot of the fishermen that I represent. I come from the coast of Maine. We have a lot of lobster fishermen. It's a huge part of our fishing industry. This is about the commercial vessel bilge and wash water discharges.
Yes.
Okay, so there's an upcoming rule around this, which I'm sure you know about, that is of great concern to a lot of the people I deal with. It's my understanding that the EPA may require all commercial vessels under 79 feet to apply for and receive individual discharge permits as a result of the expiration of the small vessel exemption in December. So recreational vessels are not required to get a permit for discharges incidental to their normal operation. Instead, the EPA develops a management practice performance standard with the Coast Guard. The
Coast Guard makes regulations that require compliance with those practices. That makes a lot of sense for the smaller vessels, in my opinion.
Okay.
I just want you to know you'd be hard-pressed to find a bigger advocate for clean water than me in Congress, and I am, staunchly in favor of that. I'm from a coastal state. We care deeply about the environment. We understand the appropriate relationship between a clean environment and a healthy economy. So I am in favor of all those things. But there has to be a way for the EPA to balance our great environmental concerns with the practical concerns of men and women who earn their living on the water. These are not giant fishing boats. They're not cruise ships. They're not, it doesn't seem appropriate that they should come under the same requirements. So can we talk about this, about how you're going to implement this rule and how they will come under it?
Yeah, my understanding is that we have been working pretty closely with the Coast Guard to reach out to all of the constituencies on this, so there's no confusion and that it can be easily implemented, and there's consistency between EPA and the Coast Guard on numeric limits, as well as timeline and implementation. If we are missing your constituency in that conversation, we will close that gap, because I know how important clean water is to Maine, and I know how seriously you take it.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that, and I would love to just talk about that further with you. I'm happy to follow up, but I think it's critically important that there's just not, they aren't lumped in with every other boat under 79 feet, that we don't just give them more time. This is a very potentially expensive endeavor for them in a time when fuel costs are high. They've got plenty of burdens on their back, so thank you for that. Let me take a completely other tack, and I don't want anyone on the committee to start laughing, but I want to talk about monarch butterflies just for a minute. In '96, enough monarchs made the journey from northern states down to Mexico to cover 50 acres of pine forest. Today, it's just about a football field. There's a lot of reasons. I consider this an indicator species, a coal, canary in a coal mine. Sorry about coal mines, but I think there is reason to be concerned, and I'm very interested on the agriculture side of this. If you plot it on a chart, you will see that increased use of Roundup sort of charts about the same way as the decrease in monarchs, and this is a significant difference. 90% of all the monarchs have disappeared in Ohio. A lot of this is because of milkweed being eliminated because of the increased use in Roundup, which most of us think is because more farmers are planting GMO Roundup resistant corn and soybeans. So I know it's a complex issue, but I see there's a $5 million increase in the chemical safety line of your budget devoted to pesticide effects on the environment.
Yes.
Are you thinking about using any of these new funds toward investigating some of the pesticides that and herbicides, I would say, herbicides?
Yeah, well, we are actually looking at some of the chemicals that you're referencing, and we're also working pretty closely with the Department of the Interior on this issue. It's all about making sure that we understand the ecological impacts and work on endangered species and other issues more effectively. And so I don't disagree with many of the issues that you've raised. I think we have a challenge when you have a multi-factor issue that's impacting, but I think you will see that the entire administration is paying pretty close attention to this issue, and those funds are really being dedicated to those efforts.
Great. Well, I will be looking forward to following that closely, and I have lots more questions, and if I don't get time today, I'll just submit them to you for further discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. We won't have any coal mines left for those canaries. But I want you to know that I planted milkweed in my backyard to attract monarch butterflies. So I'm doing my
We can start a monarch caucus right here.
That's right. Mr. Stewart was first in, so recognize him.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Administrator, good to see you again. Like we had a chance to talk before, I was a subcommittee chairman on the Committee on the Environment. We've had you before our committee.
Yes.
I think you have a tough job. You clearly have a very important job, and we want to support you in that. It won't surprise you that there are many things that you and I may disagree with, that the President and I may disagree with, and some of those have been brought out today. I'd like to come back and address some of those if we have time and more specific questions. But before I do, I'd like to make a general observation and get your reaction to it. I'm in the middle of a re-election campaign, as is everyone else here on the dais. I have to go back to my constituents every 2 years and convince them that I'm making the right decision for the people. And not just with Republicans, by the way. But I make that argument with independents and with Democrats, try to convince them that I'm, as fairly as I can, trying to represent them. And if they don't like the decisions that I make or what I am advocating for, there's a very simple solution, and it's exercised all the time, that they vote me out of office. Mm-hmm. And the House is the people's house. I think we most accurately reflect the will of the American people, which is why it's so disturbing for so many when they see your boss, the president, do what he did during the State of the Union address and stand up and essentially say that he was going to bypass the will of the American people, that he was going to implement policies and regulations contrary to the will of the House, who represent, in many cases, the will of the American people. And to my Democratic allies and friends, and they stand up and applaud that, I just think that's insane. I can't imagine them wanting to abrogate those responsibilities to the president. There are reasons that some of these initiatives and some of these regulations that we've talked about here today are so controversial because they don't reflect the will of the American people in many ways, and they have great concerns about them. And I would just ask you, do you understand our concerns on that? Do you understand how we feel like this betrays the intent of our founding fathers in bypassing the Congress and taking more and more of that power to the White House?
To be very honest with you, Congressman, no, we don't agree on that issue, because what I heard the President say and what I've heard him say over and over is that he's more than willing to work with Congress on issues like climate change. But if Congress doesn't act, he feels a compelling need to act because of the public implications of inaction. But using the current authority that's been given to our agencies, not expanding that authority.
But see, Madam, if you were using the current authority, many of us would accept that. But the problem is we don't believe you are using the current authority. We believe you're expanding the current authority. And if I could talk about and respond to your characterization of the President, using climate change and some of the initiatives, he held the House and he held the Senate for 2 years. And they didn't move that legislation. And the reason they didn't is because they knew that it was extraordinarily unpopular with the American people. Now, they like to blame us and say that the Republicans are the ones standing in the way of that, but that's not true. They had a 2-year window when they didn't move that legislation. And now that they can blame us for being obstructionists, as they say, and they say, well, we'll do it ourselves, something they were unwilling to do or unable to do, even with a Democratic Congress and a Democratic Senate. And I just don't think it's being honest when he says that the Republicans are the one who stood in the way of that, when we know that the Democrats had the opportunity to do that. If I could go on to a more specific question, this is previous to our panel here, but I have legislation which would review and which would refine some of the SAB processes. And I have to tell you again, Madam Administrator, I'm extraordinarily disappointed with the response we've gotten from some of the members of the SAB. For example, we've asked them to address charge questions and to give us response to that. And in some cases, they have responded to us saying that they have to get your permission before they will respond to us on some of those questions. Do you agree with that, or do you believe, as I do, that the Congress, as having the authority to ask them these charge questions and for them to respond to us in that?
Congressman, I think you've asked a fairly complicated issue, and let me be as clear as I can. The Science Advisory Board the role of the Science Advisory Board is strictly to look at science, not at how that science is applied through policy and law. And I think we try to respect their independence. Both you do and we do. And to the extent that we can work together to make sure that they maintain their independence, that's the most important thing that we can do.
I agree with you, which is why this is concerning to me. Because to me, their independence is, we are able to respond to the Congress independent of the administrator. And they're telling us in some cases with these charge questions, we have to seek your approval first before they'll answer those questions. And I believe that's exactly the opposite of maintaining independence.
Well, we've done the best we could to work with the committee. We've addressed these issues. When charge questions have been raised, we've certainly considered those. But we have a job to do with the Science Advisory Board, and to the extent that we can let them go about and do their business, I think the better off the American public is.
And I'll conclude with this, Mr. Chairman. Madam, are you familiar with some of the reforms that we've suggested in this legislation that addresses the scientific advisory panels and boards?
Actually, I apologize. I'm not specifically familiar with it,
Okay.
but I can make myself familiar.
Well, I would be, it may not matter now. I would be interested in your response to those, because I think it's a very sincere and a very important effort to maintain the independence of these boards.
Okay.
We believe that they have demonstrated to us in the sense that they're non-responsive in many cases, when they've had many opportunities to respond. And I'm not talking over a matter of days and weeks. I'm talking about over a period of months, even a year. And then many times the answers they give is, we have to check with the administration first. And again, there's clearly a preponderance, and their intent is to adhere to the administration line, rather than doing as that legislation was set up to do, to provide the Congress with independent scientific analysis. And if you would, I would like to, I would like your response to that as well.
Thank you for calling it to my attention.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here and
Not at
joining
all.
us today. Let me ask you a question that talks about back home. Over the past decade, New York City has made a significant investment in diverting its solid waste from landfills to recycling operations. Among the recycling options, the city has committed itself to composting as much organic waste as possible, including, most recently, food waste. For this solid waste diversion effort to be successful, the city needs to have access to a strong composting industry. I know EPA shares the city's commitment to it, and I applaud you for that. My concern is that in recent years, the use of what are called persistent herbicides may threaten the continued viability of the industry. As I understand it, these new herbicides do not break down in the process, and their presence in the finished compost product renders the compost unusable in gardens and agriculture. As the agency undertakes its periodic review of these herbicides, what steps are you taking to resolve this problem?
Yeah. I really appreciate you bringing this up. I know it's a complicated issue, but we have actually taken a look at these herbicides, and we've taken a couple of steps. One, we actually no longer allow the registration for residential use, so that we can keep it out of the composting that we so want to have happen. And in other cases, we've made label changes, and we're also, when the registrations come up for review, we're looking at these issues. I'm happy to say that I think we're on the road to addressing this pretty effectively. In 2013, we really didn't get any specific concerns raised that we had prior to. But if there's other work that we should be doing, Congressman, I think it's important that we work together on this. Composting is an essential part of a really good solid waste management strategy. And to the extent that we need to consider that when we're looking at these pesticides, we couldn't agree with you more.
Okay, so I'd like very much to find a way for us to keep in touch and see, because as you said, this is the way to go.
Yeah.
But this new issue came up, which now has created a problem where there shouldn't have been a problem at all. Let me ask you, I have a bunch of questions I'll submit for the record, but let me ask you another one. Your agency is taking a leading role in the Urban Waters Federal Partnership, which then Secretary Salazar kicked off in my district along the Harlem River several years ago. We spent years cleaning and restoring the Bronx River in a collaborative and community-oriented fashion. This federal partnership was designed to build on this model and bring the sort of success that we've had to other urban waterways. I'm particularly interested in hearing what the EPA has done in support of this great initiative and what you plan to do in the coming year. Please tell us about the successes you've had and the challenges that you face. Please also elaborate on the staffing levels and budget funds you have dedicated to this very important initiative.
Well, thank you for raising it. The Urban Waters Initiative is an extremely important program that we've initiated with the Department of the Interior, with USDA and others across the administration. It's an opportunity not only to highlight urban challenges related to water, as we've identified in New York, but it's also an opportunity to get our youth involved in these activities.
Right.
It's just so good. It's one of those that I think every side of any aisle would agree to. In this year's budget, we're looking at a presidential budget request of $4.4 million, and that would be the same as we requested last year, with the same level of FTE, which is 6. We are utilizing, certainly, I think, well beyond those funds in terms of generating interest. It's also one of those programs that's a public-private partnership. We leverage significant resources. So we continue to add projects into the mix to the extent that we can, working with the other agencies. We most recently are working in the Anacostia, which is a really exciting opportunity for us. But I'm happy to share sort of the success stories that we've had on this program. If I could do a whole lot more with it, I would be happy to. But we think we have at a level where we'll continue to grow, and the interest in the private sector will grow, and we'll find more opportunities for success.
Well, I would hope so. I would hope that we also could keep in touch on this, because one of the things I can tell my colleagues, and I've told them this before, is that when we think of water, when we think of waterways, we usually think of wide open spaces and other communities. But I think in this last generation, I don't know how many years as such, but there's been a big change where the inner cities have paid attention to the rivers that run nearby and the lakes that are nearby, and have taken a serious interest that was never taken before, to where you see now desires as part of the design that you see from a new mayor or a new governor or something, to build the waterways and to make them both recreational and business-oriented. In the Harlem River, the East River, and in our case, in many other places.
We're doing really literally job training for youth using this program. It's an opportunity for us to engage, older children, teenagers and above,
Right.
to look at how they do voluntary water monitoring. And we try to teach them at a standard where it gives them capacity to enter into the private sector. But it is a way of capturing youth in a way that's going to build continued environmental stewardship, as well as it usually, these areas are really focused on underserved communities, communities that are challenged, high minority, low income. It's breathing a sense of hope in some communities that may not have quite existed to this level before. And we have I love this program. I think it's exactly the way that the federal government should be treating states and communities, and I think it's exactly the kind of cross-agency effort that the federal government should duplicate.
Well, you have an ally here, and let's hope we can continue to build on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Administrator?
How are you?
Imagine this, I want to talk about water, too.
But, I'm well practiced now.
And I'll agree with my colleague, Ms. Pingree, about the fact that we all care about clean air and clean water. But our investments in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative are finally paying off. Last year, Presque Isle, which was Pennsylvania area of concern, was delisted. In northeastern Ohio, where I represent, we have completed a project at the Ashtabula area of concern, and we're either complete or nearing completion on. And work has been accelerated, and I believe your agency expects to complete management actions at 5 or more areas of concern by the end of 2015.
That's right.
Since the GLRI's inception, 29 beneficial use impairments have been removed at 13 areas of concern in 6 states, more than tripling the number that have been beneficial use impairments, removing in the preceding 22 years. With all these accomplishments, you probably understand my disappointment with the administration would propose cutting such a successful program that was producing such strong results. Why would the administration want to cut such an impressive program, especially given the amount of work left to do, like cleaning up more toxic hotspots, dealing with algal blooms in Lake Erie, and stopping invasive species?
I think it may be too strong a word to say that we want to. I think we're faced with some tough choices, but I do not at all disagree with you that it is a tremendously valuable program. We are looking at a current fiscal year 2015 presidential budget request of $275 million. That is down from the $300 million the prior year before. It's just a reflection that we're trying to continue to build on the great work, hoping that the 275 can build on infrastructure and information we've already gathered before, but it is not a sense of a lack of interest or commitment or an acknowledgement that this isn't a great program and needed.
Well, you know, Congress accomplished a great bipartisan victory last year by getting it to $300 million.
Yeah.
And especially when facing such difficult budget caps, and I hope we can work together to increase that number.
I would hope so.
Even in
Thank
these
you.
trying budget times, if you will. But secondly, if I may, I represent the great state of Ohio with the Marcellus Shale as well,
Yeah.
and we are blessed with natural gas resources. As you know, the states are primary regulators of oil and gas development, have been for over 60 years. Doing this at the state level allows regulation to be tailored to each individual state and to its geology, the needs of its citizens, and so on. Essentially, one size does not fit all. Having said that, the concerns are the EPA is now planning to impose regulations laying on top of state regulations. Can you please tell me what your plans are with regards to the rules that will impact oil and gas development? And are you planning new air, water, waste, or reporting rules? And also, if you would, what should we expect coming out of the EPA in the next 2 years?
I'm happy to answer the question. As you know, that we have been requesting significant funds just to take a look and do research in this area to ensure that natural gas is being done safe and responsibly. I know who the first line of defense is, and it's the states when you're talking about water. And so we are very respectful of that, and we will continue to be. And I know that not every shale deposit is the same. And there are different challenges in different parts of the country. So having said that, the one exception I would raise is the air issues. We have already regulated to some extent volatile organic carbon emissions from fracking operations. I think we did that with great sensitivity to align with the states to make sure that we were not duplicating their efforts or requiring reporting beyond what states have been doing themselves or being respectful of that reporting. And we're still continuing to take a look because we did that with natural gas. You will see that we're going to be looking at that from oil and combined natural gas and oil wells as well. But that is not about different regional issues. It is about what technologies are available and taking a look at that moving forward. That is part of the methane strategy under the Climate Action Plan. So that you'll be seeing some white papers come out, and some, but not direct regulation. We'll have plenty of time to take a look and to work together on those issues.
Well, you certainly have plenty to do, Madam Administrator, so I would volunteer that this is probably best left to the states. And I yield back my time.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Joyce. Mr. Valdeo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ms. Administrator McCarthy. I want to associate myself with the comments of the chair and our full committee chair on the water issue. The water issue is also a very big deal in my district, and I know that it's been brought up quite a bit today, so I don't feel I need to bring it up anymore. But I did have a question. It is my understanding that the EPA has not yet finalized blending targets for the renewable fuel standard of 2014.
Yeah.
EPA's November proposal took a common sense approach by setting a mandate to hold biofuel production constant because consumers and their vehicles just can't handle any more ethanol. Yet at a January conference of State Departments of Agriculture, press reports quoted you as saying, "I have heard loud and clear that you don't think we hit that right, and that given all the feedback, the final rule, when released, will be in a shape that you will see that we have listened to your comments."
Correct.
To me, these comments suggest the EPA may reconsider its previous RFS proposal to appease agriculture interests to the detriment of consumers. Should your comments be taken to mean consumers will have to continue using more and more ethanol regardless of what their vehicles were designed to handle? And according to your assessment of the law, does EPA have the authority to finalize a rule outside of the existing November proposal?
Well, let me answer your first question. I believe that if you take a look at my comment, it said that that clearly, in particular the ethanol and the biodiesel industry, do not believe that the proposal represented the full breadth of what the agency could or should be doing to achieve the congressionally mandated levels in the law. And so I told them that I would be taking a look at comments, and they would see that we properly considered those. I would also suggest that if you asked me if it also considered other opinions and would be considering those, my answer would be the same. We will take a look at all comments coming in. And in terms of the final rule, we are going to do our best to meet the requirements under the law, but we do need to continue to recognize that ethanol in the ethanol levels in the law we are not able to see those absorbed in the market. We want to bring no cars at risk. We don't think we need to. We ever would. And we're going to make sure to take a reasonable approach that recognizes the infrastructure challenges and the inability at this point to achieve the levels of ethanol that are in the law.
Okay. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I represent a part of California, Kern County. I share that with the Whip, Kevin McCarthy. And obviously oil production is a large part of our economy there. And so you've said that hydraulic fracturing can be done safely and have agreed with former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson that there have been no confirmed cases of hydraulic fracturing impacting drinking water. Given the President's climate action plan relies heavily on the use of natural gas, what is your vision for educating the American public that hydraulic fracturing is safe, creates jobs, and has lowered American energy costs?
That's a really great question, because it gives me an ability to, again, acknowledge that natural gas has been a tremendous economic opportunity for this country. And our goal is to make sure that it's consistent and it's done safe and effectively, so it remains an environmental win as well. And so one of the things we're doing is actually requesting funds to continue to do science around this, because the EPA would like to be able to say very clearly about natural gas and how do you extract it in a way that remains safe and responsible. That is our goal, and we think we speak best when we speak to the science.
Okay. As I understand it, the EPA plans to release the fracking study to the public at the same time it is submitted to the Science Advisory Board for peer review. Is it normal for the EPA to release its scientific studies before the peer review is completed? And are you concerned that by releasing the study before peer review is completed that the EPA is setting itself up for a situation in which it may have to backtrack on findings that do not stand up to peer review? Couldn't that result in the public being unnecessarily scared or misled?
My understanding is that a draft study is being planned to be released at the end of this year. You're right, we would put that out for public comment, and would also make sure that it goes to the Science Advisory Board, because we've established a great panel to take a look at that. It is not my understanding that we're trying to confuse anybody. It becomes public as soon as it goes to the Science Advisory Board. So they're the ones that are going to be able to be managing all those science comments, and anything else we'll be able to consider as the Science Advisory Board completes its peer review. So it's, again, just a robust process that will be transparent and in the public review, and we'll take a look at those comments. But this will be an ongoing effort to make sure that we understand the science.
And then switching gears again, weed resistance is a problem unique to biotech crops. Ensuring farmers have access to multiple modes of action to address weed resistance is very important. One way to help farmers is to ensure that they have access to new herbicide-tolerant crops. I understand USDA has not deregulated products that will give farmers some additional ammunition against stubborn weeds, and that the EPA continues to wait for the USDA's deregulation decisions before taking action on herbicide approvals. Can you help me understand why is it taking so long for these crops to get into the marketplace? And is your agency required to wait on USDA's regulation or deregulation before the EPA takes action? Are USDA and EPA efficiently coordinating the deregulation of herbicide-tolerant crops? And if so, what coordination has occurred that can be quantified as an improvement in coordination between the agencies?
We've met, again, you're raising a very good and timely issue. It is an active coordination between USDA USDA and EPA because it's important for us to respect the decision and the primacy of the decision of the USDA. That does not mean that we're not doing anything. We are not making this decision in sequence. We are actually coordinating, so they're doing their work, we're inputting into it, and they're inputting into ours. And you'll see that that means that we'll be getting some decisions out from both agencies very quickly.
Is there any requirement that you release together or work together, or?
Probably there's no requirement that we do it that way, but in my opinion, good management means that we coordinate with one another. That's what the industry has asked us to do. This is the smartest way to get it done as quickly as possible, recognizing that we both have a decision to make in this process.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. Mr. Moran.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I was interested in the comments on cellulosic ethanol. I do obviously support renewable fuel and the renewable fuel standards, but it does seem as though this corn-based requirement is a bit of a rip-off to the not only the people who pay for gas, but who buy food. I mean, it's got to be a major contributing element to the fact that the cost of food has gone up by 60% above the general rate of inflation, and I think it's largely driven by the standard that's artificially raising the price of corn. So I hope we'll look at that. It's.
I think, Congressman, we all agree, and the statute's pretty clear, that we're really trying to get to advanced in cellulosic. That's the goal of the renewable fuel standard.
Yeah. Good. Mr. Serrano raised this issue of municipal solid waste. We clearly need to find better ways of dealing with municipal solid waste, and he's talking about the commercial use of the stuff that comes from restaurants and so on, which is terribly important. Municipalities are paying an enormous amount of money to dispose of this stuff, but if we can convert it to something more useful, that's great. So I'm glad that Joe raised that issue. Let me ask you further about that issue, larger issue though. Over the past 2 years, we've been engaged along with a number of stakeholders in improving and trying to update the Environmental Protection Agency's MSW characterization report. We want to be able to more closely examine the major types of recycling systems and their resulting end markets, because it could lead to more informed decision-making at the local and state levels where recycling and solid waste programs are chosen and implemented. Now, we understand there's a lot of different ways of measuring it, but the fact that you collect these materials doesn't necessarily mean that they're recycled into new products. Yeah. Currently, the report only reports on what's being picked up, not necessarily what is being ultimately recycled. So I wonder what your approach might be in terms of reaching out to those industries that are collecting and processing and sorting and reselling this recyclables collected, so that we can gain a better understanding of the end product of their recycling systems.
Well, I don't know if I can tell you the complete work that we do, because clearly our Office of Solid Waste does a lot of work with the industry itself. But one issue that's on my radar screen related to this, Congressman, is our definition of solid waste. It's basically an opportunity to encourage this type of commercial recycling. The prior administration did a rule that we are relooking at, because it hasn't effectively generated the kind of interest at the state level that we thought it would generate to advance recycling of materials that would then be reused, genuine recycling. And states are a little bit reluctant to take advantage of the rule as it was prior written, and we've reproposed it, and we're looking to finalize that rule. What that rule does is really set a system of regulation, so that you can properly recycle, but in a way that the communities themselves know that if these efforts are underway in their community, that it won't pose a hazard to them. And so I think there are ways in which we can look at this in a variety of ways, not just technical assistance, but really pushing markets by providing, again, a certain regulatory framework that states can take advantage of, where we would have the capacity to define it a little bit better than the states, and they can take advantage of it or not. And that's what this particular rule is all about. So we're trying to do it both individually through technical assistance as well as systemically to provide a more solid foundation for our recycling industries to grow.
Good. Well, that's good to hear. I know a lot of folks, they religiously recycle all their stuff, and then they hear, well, when it's just dumped in the same pile, it just is to make the homeowner feel better about it, and the end result, it doesn't achieve what they want.
That's particularly a problem with electronic waste, and it's been a consistent problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Chairman, I have just one other issue here that I want to bring up, and this is with regard to catalytic converters and federal standards. The EPA, you have an aftermarket catalytic converter standard that hasn't been updated since 1986, and as a result, California, their Air Resource Board, developed a standard that will take effect in California in 2015. There's some concern. New York is doing the same thing, putting out their own regulation. Our concern is what it might mean if we have a host of states coming up with their own standards. There's also a cost factor here. If repair facilities have to install the California Air Resource Board certified converter, the cost difference can be between 35% and 40% more than the ones certified by the EPA. So I wonder if the EPA is working on coming up with a model standard for the nation so that we don't have 25 or 30 different standards throughout the country. We obviously want to make the converters more environmentally friendly, but we also need to make sure that they're affordable to the consumer.
Congressman, I do not know the answer to your question, but we'll certainly take it up when we get back to the office. I understand the issue. I wasn't aware that individual states were moving out, and it had been so long since we've revisited this, but we'll take a look at it and see what we need.
Good for you. Thank you very much, Administrator. You've done a terrific job today, and it hasn't necessarily been smooth sailing, but your answers have been very responsive, and in my view, you've done a great job, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for all your years of service.
Thank you. Thank you, Administrator. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. California always obviously leads the way when it comes to clean air. We put out regulations before anyone else does. We have a history of that in the United States.
And you're doing great. The air's much better, certainly.
And one of the reasons why we have much better air and clean air is because of the DERA program.
Oh.
And this has
that
been
was
a very
smooth transition.
It's been a very successful program. Senator Feinstein, Senator Boxer, and I agree. And Jerry Lewis, who wrote the original legislation for the California Clean Air Act in the state of California. And why? Because it works. We're removing old diesel engines from the inventory throughout the country. It especially affects, as you know, PM 2.5 and particulate matter, which was a big problem in the South Coast Air Quality Basin. And so it's distressing to us when we see that the administration proposes to eliminate the diesel emission grant program, which is, as I mentioned earlier, has $13 of economic benefit per federal dollar, based on your analysis. So you can explain, why would you want to remove a program that has such real achievement and really works?
Chairman, I'm not trying to be contrary, but I don't want to do this. I want to respect the budget limitations that I've been given and make the best decisions I can. and I'm trying to balance a lot of interests here. We've had many years of significant funding of the DARA program. It has provided a wealth of benefits.
It has had the largest effect.
Decisions need to be made, and they were difficult.
Yeah, in the area that I live, of course, the Port of LA, Long Beach, all these trucks are around there, and helping these independent truck drivers change over to these new modern engines that have 90% less emissions. 90% less emissions. It's really, it's had incredible effect on air quality in my part of the world. So I'm going to work with Mr. Moran and our friends in the Senate. I'm sure, I suspect you probably knew we would probably put the money back in the program, since it's been around for such a long time and it has such tremendous success and had such bipartisan support. But with that, I'm going to go back to water for a second here. I think Mike wanted to come back.
You're making me shuffle my papers here.
Yeah, Mike wanted to come back for some questions, but I don't know if he's going to make it back or not. But apparently 117 million people whose drinking water is derived in part, according to the statistics I just received, from intermittent streams. So the question is, do they have a higher death rate than those who get their water from rivers and lakes?
I don't believe the water is drawn directly from the intermittent streams. Those intermittent streams are relied on to support the navigable waters below, which is both supporting the surface water and groundwater that provides that drinking water.
Well, since the science is complete and just being correlated and double-checked, do we know that these 117 million people get specific illnesses that are attributable to known elements that are washed through these intermittent streams?
The 117 million is simply an indication of looking at what waters feed drinking water supplies, and part of those are these intermittent streams that are fed through rain events or that are seasonal.
I think I'm trying to get to, in other words, are we fixing a problem or are we just complying with this proposed law?
I guess what I'm suggesting is that the waters of the U.S. were designed to protect drinking water, to ensure that natural resources are protected for fishing and hunting and swimming, and that these streams are important for that. But my major point in that was that these streams are critical to drinking water supplies, and that's the reason why they should be considered, and currently are, waters of the U.S.
Okay, and I'm sure Mr. Simpson is going to expand on that. I'm going to change directions once again on these issues of denying a permit before someone is even able to apply for a permit. And this is regarding the Bristol Bay Pebble Mine watershed study. Is this the new, this is the new EPA to say no?
No, sir. I wouldn't characterize the actions.
Because I think business community wants to know why even apply to do anything if it's going to be no before we even start.
In the history of EPA, we've only used this 404C process, which is what we've just taken a first step to consider. 13 times, only once when we haven't had a permit in the mix. This is the second time. So I don't think you want to think of this as any trend. It's a very unique circumstance, Chairman. It's a unique resource. It is one of the world's largest and most active in producing sockeye salmon fishery in just a beautiful area that's very unique, and this is a unique mine. And so we've taken a first step to look at this as to whether or not we should take action, and I think it was appropriate to do that.
Well, this country has I know it may be antiquated to some, but due process is part of this country.
And it will be thoroughly debated, transparent, and public comments if we decide to continue beyond this first step, which is a discussion with the company and a discussion with the state and the Army Corps.
Yeah, because this unilateral determination without any due process is very troubling to me. And if there's a trend of this, as the chairman mentioned earlier, this is going to have a significant effect on our economy. And with that barking noise in the background, I now recognize Mr. Simpson.
I was with Ducks Unlimited, and he had a quacking when it went off.
Well, the worst thing was I happened to be presiding on the floor of the House, and I'd call my senator and left a message to call me back, and I went in the chair and presiding, and we were debating what to do with the rescue dogs after Hurricane Katrina, and my phone started barking. And it was not pre-planned.
I guess
Parliamentarian had to leave. Parliamentarian had to leave the floor. He was laughing so hard. But I want you to know that under Chairman Calvert's direction, I went over to the floor to screw things up so that we wouldn't have votes in the middle of this, so that we could finish your testimony and not have to have you wait around for an hour. That's the kind of guys we are, and I appreciate that.
Was it a particular expertise he was going for there?
Yeah, I can screw things up. Back to the Clean Water Act and the
Yes.
new rule that's out.
Yes,
You've put out a list of agricultural exemptions
yes.
that the EPA has released, but that only applies, as I understand it, to Section 404, the dredge and fill of the Clean Water Act. Is that correct?
Do I know the answer to that question? I have to double check with you. I believe that it's an exemption under the waters, under the Clean Water Act waters of the U.S. It may be beyond that. But it certainly wouldn't apply to direct discharges that would be covered under NPDES. So but let me double check. I don't want to be incorrect in my.
Yeah, it is. From what I understand, it's the way I understand it, and I might be incorrect. I don't know.
I believe it's.
But I'd like to clear it up, and that is that the exemptions only apply to the 404, and as I understand it, a farmer engaging in normal activities would have to adhere to the NRCS standard in order to avail himself or herself of the exemption.
Yes.
Has that always been true?
Actually, this is an expansion of exemptions we would recognize. Let me start by saying we're changing no exemption that currently exists under the law with this proposal. All of the current agriculture, silviculture exemptions continue as is. What this is an opportunity for us to work with USDA to encourage additional conservation, which benefits the ag community, which benefits our natural resources, and recognizing that it also benefits water quality. So it's trying to, again, provide more certainty. It doesn't mean that all of those 52 prior to would have required a permit. What it says is that we are providing certainty that you don't even need to ask anymore as to whether or not this is normal agricultural practice. We are defining it as best we can.
Okay.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
You know, I really like this proposal, or I wouldn't
I know.
be talking so much about it. But the other thing we did was we have also put out what we call an interpretive rule, because that will allow us to look at the comments that come in and continue to work with USDA and agriculture to add to that list. Because as much as we can define agricultural practices that are exempt, without question, the more that a farmer can do their farming without worrying about whether they're doing something wrong. That's the goal.
But the interpretive rule is just that, an interpretive rule that can be changed at will.
Well, actually...
It can be added to, it can be subtracted from.
Well, the goal is that we are going to continue to add to those practices, but the only thing that it would do is to, again, make the exemption clearer so that you don't have to say, is this an agricultural practice that's exempt? We're defining as much as we can agricultural practices so that certainty is there.
And I understand your interpretation of what you're trying to do, but understand the concern that people have that, oh, they're just putting this in an interpretive rule, which means they can change it anytime they want to, which means they get the final rule through, we think we've got these exemptions, and a year later they can come back and eliminate them all without having to change the rule.
The only thing that
so that's a concern out there is all I'm saying.
I understand. We'll try to work through those in the comment period, but it's clearly an attempt, at least its intent, is to do as much as we can to provide certainty to the agriculture community that they can farm the way they need to farm.
Okay. The proposed rule,
ranches as they need to.
as you said, wants to bring certainty to ambiguity, and it talks in here that one section indicates that all waters within a floodplain would be jurisdictional. What floodplain are we talking about? 100-year, 200, 500-year floodplain?
We are talking about wetlands, and we're using the same definition of high water as the original rule statute.
Okay.
So we're not changing that at all.
One other subject, different subject, if I can find out what the heck I did with my stuff.
Mr. Former Chairman, while you're looking, could I?
Rule. It's the original rule. Sorry.
Original rule.
Could I just, would you mind yielding for a question? Because I do want to fully understand this. Don't 30 states defer to the federal law so that they don't have their own regulations? They rely upon the federal regulation. But is it different in the West? Do the states tend to have their own regulations that are different than the federal regulations?
This brings up the question I was just going to ask.
Okay.
As you know, the state of Idaho recently passed legislation that will eventually take the lead in the state claiming primacy on the Clean Water Act. States can do that, or they can let the EPA do it, and Idaho has chosen to let the EPA do it in the past, take the lead in that. I don't know how many states are left that leave it to the EPA. Do you know?
Well, I'm told it's 30.
30? 30 is about right.
That the EPA takes
Right.
primacy on
Yes.
in 20. Well, they've passed this legislation. The state will spend millions on multi-year transition to primacy. And once it gains primacy, it will spend millions each year on its own program. That's generally why states don't take primacy, is because of the cost.
Sure.
I'm told that no federal funds exist to assist the states with the transition or with the ongoing program once it's started up. So I guess my question is this. If a state is going to spend millions to run a program now run by the EPA and is going to hire dozens of people to handle a program now run by federal employees, why are there no savings in your agency, and why is there no assistance to the state in running the program or helping to at least transition to the state program? Why, as the state program grows, doesn't the federal government program shrink?
Well, it would certainly work with any state that wanted to take primacy on any program that the agency operated. But I guess what I would indicate to you, Congressman, is that I do not see this rule changing the dynamic between the federal government and states. The rule clearly preserves that effective state-federal partnership.
Well, this is outside that rule. This has nothing to do with the rule.
Okay.
That I'm talking about. I'm talking about the state taking primacy over its over the Clean Water Act, which means they're going to spend millions that's currently spent by the federal government. Yet I don't see the savings in your budget on the savings that the federal government will save by not having to do that.
I believe that the EPA has resources to help with that transition and to support the state in that effort. If we are actually now running a program that they're going to begin to run, we would accommodate that and
Okay.
certainly encourage it. The more you can get state-level
Right.
regulation, the better off all of us like it. It
Yeah.
provides a better safety net for all of us.
The gentleman would yield for a moment.
Sure.
It might be appropriate to point out that the Western governors, which is a bipartisan group of governors, are absolutely opposed to this new proposed rule.
Yeah. They are.
Since we were bringing up
It's going to take a lot more discussion and understanding on all sides, both from the EPA to understand the concerns of the Western governors and Western legislators, and also from all of us to understand what this rule actually does. If I could ask one more question, this takes just a minute.
I now realize it's the NPDES
Yeah,
program
right.
you're talking about, and there's really only 4 states that don't have primacy
Yeah,
on that
I
program.
thought there was only a few.
And so I'm happy to work with you. If the state feels like we are not being responsive to them, I'm more than happy to do that, because
Okay.
this is a very encouraging step.
Okay. In June 2012, the EPA released the Integrated Municipal Stormwater and Wastewater Planning Approach Framework.
Yes.
That laid out a new model to help communities meet their regulatory obligations under the Clean Water Act in an integrated manner. If successfully implemented, this model could help communities more affordably manage their clean water obligations while ensuring continuous progress towards water quality goals. To date, however, Only a handful of communities have come forward to express an interest in working with the agency on this initiative, and our understanding is that, for the most part, these communities are ones that are engaged in consent decree negotiations or are operating under an EPA enforcement action. The true test of this new framework will be whether communities that are not facing an enforcement action but have large water quality challenges nevertheless can use the integrated planning approach as it has come to be known to meet these challenges more affordably. But these communities may need some help to develop plans in order to take advantage of this model, and these plans will cost money, some upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, last year we suggested, this committee suggested, that a small amount of money be set aside in the EPA's budget to support 10 to 20 pilot communities to demonstrate and evaluate the effectiveness of this model. This appropriations request had broad bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, but in final conference negotiations we weren't able to get it across the finish line, in part because we couldn't convince the agency that supporting pilot communities with planning grants would help further their own initiative. We'd like to try this again this year, and what I'd like to know is, will we have the support of the agency to undertake this pilot effort in order to demonstrate and evaluate the effectiveness of the integrated planning model to help communities meet their water quality goals?
Congressman, I'd love to talk to you about it. It was an issue that we knew was on the radar screen. We would have loved to have had significant enough resources to be able to accommodate it. I know that the integrated planning effort that has been underway has been a successful one. But you're right, we want to move beyond an enforcement or compliance venue and make this a much proactive approach. One of the reasons why we're looking at our green infrastructure issues and trying to have money that accommodates working with 100 communities was we thought that that might be a more effective approach to integrating thinking about stormwater and wastewater in a collaborative way. And so we do have funding in our budget to address these issues. Perhaps we didn't quite agree on the venue or the vehicle for doing that, but I do know that NACWA has been actively engaged in thinking about these pilots. They've been working with us on workshops across the country, and we're happy to continue this discussion.
Okay. I appreciate that.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simpson. As Mr. Simpson knows, when he was chair last year, I strongly supported this as well. It was both sides of this subcommittee that wanted this integrated planning initiative money. It's only $2 million, and the cost of compliance can get substantial, and of course the water systems pass it right on to the consumer. So it does seem to be a way of saving money. So for what it's worth, you know, this is going to be something that both sides agree on, so I would suspect you're going to see it again. It'd be nice to be able to, you know, work with you instead of having to impose it.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
You bet. Thank you, and thank you for being here today. And Mr. Calvert, thanks, Chairman, for the extra time that I had here. And I look forward to working with you so that I can understand where you're coming from on this new rule, and you can understand some of the concerns we have on that new rule. So.
And you're right, only the 404 permit requirements is the exemption for the NRCS issues, so you're right.
Thank you.
It's a good
Appreciate
way to end.
Thank you. If there's no further questions, one last comment. A number of House committees remain frustrated with EPA's lack of compliance with document requests and subpoenas. Specifically, the House Oversight Committee has asked that at least 2 outstanding subpoenas, one related to the Pebble Mine, the other concerning EPA emails referring to congressional requests for information, as well as an outstanding request for documents related to John Beal. Also, your Office of Congressional Affairs is preventing the Science Advisory Board from responding to requests for information that was mentioned earlier from the House Science Committee. So as the committee continues to consider funding, we'd like to have your commitment to fully and timely comply with these requests for documents and information from the House.
You have my full commitment that we will be responding to these issues if you feel that we haven't already, and we have been producing significant amounts of documents in a timely way, and we'll continue to do that.
Yeah, thank you. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I don't know.
Good job, Jason.
I'm going to vote no.
Talk to you later, Jim.